Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to get started. So thanks for your interest in being here. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Nigel Poole, who is starting a visiting fellowship with us here at CIMMYT. So Nigel is ending his professorship at SOAS soon, early next year. So he's still currently active there, but was able to already come and join us during this week to at least to start thinking about the portfolio as we move ahead. And then as of next year, he'll be more actively engaged, partly based in the UK, but on also supporting some of our work and thinking on the nutritional agenda, and so also seeing how we engage with the nutritional task force, which has been active since the last Science Week. And we hope to reinvigorate it with some fresh thinking from Nigel as well, in terms of how CIMMYT can position itself in that the whole space of nutrition and agriculture. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Nigel, who will be presenting some of his past work and maybe some initial reflections on the way forward. But so basically, he will be here with us over the coming year, but this time only for this very week. So if you want to catch him, he's here up to Saturday, and then he'll be out attending to his normal business, and then remotely available again as of in the new year. So Nigel, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ola, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming during your lunchtime. It's a privilege to be here and a pleasure to meet you all, or at least meet you little by little. I want to talk about a research program that we have just completed, working out of the University of London. It's called Leveraging Agriculture for Nutrition in South Asia. That is the LANSA bit. And I'll make some prior comments, some of which will be familiar to you. You probably don't really need me to tell you there are 800 million people or more who lack food security. The nature of malnutrition you'll know something about. Perhaps the undernutrition and micronutrient deficiencies, and then overnutrition is a triple burden. And I will spend perhaps most of the section talking on LANSA generally, but focus on my own work in Afghanistan, which has been on food security, dietary diversity, and particularly learning a bit more about seasonality. Misquoting the Bible, you cannot live on bread and tea alone. I will end up with some comments on staple crops, which I think is really why I'm here, and what we might be able to think about. I'm new to this area. I have to confess that I'm coming out of a micronutrient camp back into macronutrients, or at least different types of crops from what we talk about. But that'll become clear as we go along. I place my work within the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think this maps pretty closely onto your own interest and background here at CIMMYT. For me, people are in the centre. The goals are 1, 2, 3. You'll know those, I guess. So my primary focus in my work has been on those, but also extending very much into the green. And I think that's where a number of your interests actually lie as well. It's not that the blue round and about isn't important, and things like gender equality really do matter, but they're sort of peripheral to the, they're not peripheral issues, but they're peripheral to the topic that I really want to talk about, and what I spend most of my time thinking about. Food security exists, blah, blah, blah. The FAO definition, I think, is pretty widely known. It does include safe and nutritious food that meets the dietary needs and food preferences, etc., etc., etc. So the nutrition dimension is integral, but I think up till fairly recently, most people have talked about food security rather than just nutrition. Obviously, nutrition is not just a question of energy and protein, but micronutrients matter. And I think, for me, simply put, I've been reading some CIMMYT literature, but for me the difference between food security and nutrition security is the consideration of micronutrients. I'll pick up on that at the end. How important is malnutrition? Hugely important, the number one driver of the global burden of disease. The economic losses are frightening. I don't know how people calculate these, or had not calculated these, but $3.5 trillion lost is a lot of zeros. I can't imagine it. But still, 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies due to adequate intakes of a range of vitamins and minerals. So it's a huge problem. Stunting is an interesting approach to the topic. It's just an indicator, of course. It doesn't matter if you're short. It doesn't make much difference if you're tall. But, so there's nothing wrong with being short, but stunting does affect the lives of lots of children around the world. It's just an indicator, but it's an indicator of really important things that are wrong, particularly in children. And micronutrient deficiencies often set in the first 1,000 days of life, which is gestation and just up two and a bit years. From conception to 2 years of age, cause irrecoverable damage. I say, actually in italics, irrecoverable, because just a month or so ago I read a paper saying that actually some of the lost damage can be recovered over time. But that's one paper among many which say that the impacts on growth and development of children, impaired physical, intellectual and social functions, etc., are really damaging and have generational consequences, or rather intergenerational consequences, because there is also research to show that stunting among girls, not just boys but girls and therefore young women, does affect long-term physical development, and their children are damaged because of mothers stunting earlier on. So there's a lot we don't know, but what we know is pretty serious and worrying. Why work in South Asia? Well, I think there's malnutrition in lots of parts of the world, but we did our work in South Asia where nearly half of the malnourished or the undernourished population of the world live, and interestingly where agriculture is the main source of livelihoods for 60% of the population. So here in South Asia we've got largely agricultural economies, agricultural people, and yet experiencing severe malnourishment. There are other population groups that I think are really important. I regret that there's so little focus on Latin America, and having worked with indigenous groups myself for some years, I'm conscious that they are groups in Latin America, but also other parts of the world, Australia, Canada, and plenty of other places, that where there are very disfavored groups as far as nutrition is concerned. So it's not just about South Asia, nor even sub-Saharan Africa. The interesting thing about Asia, though, is there's rapid rates of development, but these are not leading to rapid improvements in the nutritional status of the population. So our program was funded by the UK government and aimed to address how can South Asian agriculture, food systems and related policies and interventions contribute to improved nutrition, primarily focusing on this micronutrient malnutrition. The target groups were those with 1,000 days, so infants and young children, adolescent girls, and mothers more generally. It was a 6-year program. We worked with partners in the partners in the UK, also IFPRI, but also in-country partners, and I would acknowledge the work that I was able to do in Afghanistan, particularly with a UK NGO called AfghanAid, the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, and a small NGO, COAM, in Bamyan. I will talk about the work that we did with them later. But it was 6 or 7 years. I've actually still got data from the livestock sector that I've got to work on. So for me, it's still going on, but the program actually finished in January of this year. Our countries were Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. You probably know where those are. You probably know where Afghanistan is, but I'll be referring later to the map of Afghanistan, Kabul being the capital, and Bamyan, the province in particular, sort of central province, where I was doing some of this work that I'll speak about later. A lot of people live there, so it really is important. We began with a framework that now more or less widely accepted by Kadiyala, one of our colleagues from India, now at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, that tries to conceptualize the pathways through which agriculture can impact on nutrition. Some of them are blooming obvious, like agriculture as a source of food. Agriculture as a source of income is also pretty straightforward, even if people don't eat the crops and livestock. that they produce. They can sell them and then buy food. Big question is, what sort of food do they buy? Agricultural policies and food prices, trade policy, subsidy policy, credit policies, infrastructure policies, investments made by governments and controls obviously are designed to impact the agricultural sector and will have effects on food prices, either enhancing prices for farmers to stimulate production, of course, will affect prices for consumers in a negative way, and so on. So things begin to get a little bit complicated when you abstract from the field and look at the policy environment. 3 areas that have been isolated are critically important to do with the role of women. Women's employment. Women's employment is a good thing if they're earning money and spending it on the family. It's not a good time if it's not a good thing so much for nutrition, at least, if it detracts from women's role in the household economy. I'm not being sexist at all in that. The reality is that household management, which is largely the responsibility of women, can be affected positively or negatively by what women do. Their status and decision-making power and control of income, for example, resources, is hugely important. Probably women are more likely to spend resources on children and well-being than men. Terrible generalization, but let's go with it for the time being, and we can talk about it later. But women's role in agriculture is critical. Their own health and nutritional status, as I've indicated in terms of the not just the stunting, but their own well-being also affects the well-being of the target groups that we're concerned about. Those are the 6 pathways that have been commonly identified and accepted. I would add 2 more, which are much more macro. The role of industry, competitiveness, the role of the entrepreneurism, and the way in which food can be made more or less accessible and available to consumers. And secondly, even larger macroeconomic changes. A boost to the agricultural GDP will boost the economy more generally, particularly where it's a high proportion of overall GDP. And so the economic effects of that will have an effect on food and nutrition. What did we do? I'll go quickly through this. Our work was organised in 3 pillars and 3 cross-cutting themes. So we looked at the social and political and economic contexts. Right, this is largely social science and economics, but we did have a lot of nutritionists working with us. But we were looking at policies to see what effect they had on agriculture and nutrition and see if there were positive effects. We narrowed down to policies and programs, a more specific focus on details, and also looked at the role of business through value chains and wider food systems to see how they drove impacts on nutrition. And we also looked at individual agricultural interventions to see the extent to which they actually had effects, whether or not they were designed to impact on nutrition, what effects they had. We had cross-cutting issues, of course, gender had to be there. Innovation systems, we didn't do so much in that, which is probably, there was a paper that we wrote, but I think it's one of the weaker parts of what we did and certainly didn't have anything really to do with plant breeding. Fragility was hugely important, and my own work in Afghanistan, I cite at the bottom, was a very exciting piece of work. I really enjoyed it, but it did show how, in the particular case of Afghanistan, how fragmented and incoherent the policy making and the practice is in that particular country. Conditions that would be repeated elsewhere, I think, perhaps not so acutely. We did develop I'll skip through that, and you don't worry about the detail, but we developed a framework which we published in Food Policy that tried to link product supply, the individual firm environment, what happens within firms, and what happens within industries, and then the food distribution system, to capture the role of food systems and to capture the role, to think of ways in which value chains operated, and most importantly, where you might intervene to bring positive effects. So how governments can affect changes in food demand, food supply, and value chains through the businesses themselves. One interesting little piece of work done out of Pakistan, I'll mention because it concerns wheat, but it was industrial fortification of wheat. It does illustrate some of the complications that we discovered, and There was a public-private partnership in Pakistan that was financed by the UK government. It's a no-brainer to add iron and vitamins to flour. Why not do that? You can reach the whole country, can't you? Well, the answer is no, you can't, because this is a nice quote from the authors in Pakistan, but the assumption that a sort of technical intervention would solve what's a socioeconomic problem, it didn't really work. Essentially, industrial milling was the means whereby the government, with UK support, added mixes, premixes to the flour in order to have a fortified product that would address the iron and vitamin A deficiencies. Easy peasy, right? Except, 40-50% of the population don't buy flour from industrial processing, from mills. And in the case of Afghanistan, we didn't work in it on this problem, but much of the milling is done in a place like that, and scattered, small mills scattered over the country, quite inaccessible, absolutely impossible to fortify, such that Gain, who work in this area on food fortification, realized that the feasibility of flour fortification through small-scale local mills is very low. It just doesn't work. So industrial fortification is a no-brainer, except does it actually reach the target population? Well, it could meet the urban poor, but not the rural poor, and that's mainly the populations that we're dealing with, the highly malnourished populations in South Asia. It was an interesting piece of work, but just highlighted some of the complications and assumptions that people can make about how food is going to be delivered. We did work on inputs, or at least we did a systematic literature review of inputs in South Asia, which is getting a bit close to CIMIT territory. Perhaps there's no great surprise that the evidence from the literature shows that improved productivity of land does correlate positively with farm household nutrition outcomes. Some things we assume, but some things it's nice to be able to show, and it has been done. Boost productivity, and farm household nutrition outcomes do actually improve, maybe through the food channel or maybe through the income channel, who knows. But more worryingly, there's very little evidence that intensifying agriculture in marginal and unproductive, well, less productive lands, unirrigated lands, and this is what applies to Afghanistan, for example, it doesn't work. We could explore that later. Incidentally, that's the Kabul River near Nangarhar in eastern Afghanistan. Pretty good land. Generally the soils are fine. Throw water on it and a seed, and it grows in Afghanistan. Trouble is, there's not much water, and seeds, perhaps you know as much about that as I do. So the role of the input industry, it's got to be more than just seeds and fertilizer and irrigation. There are lots of other reasons why things do or don't work. Just summarising very briefly, 6 years' work by, hundreds of people. We did look to the enabling environment as something that's really important, and taking a systems approach. You can't just talk about agriculture and nutrition. You have to talk about politics, you have to talk about gender and empowerment, you have to talk about water and sanitation and so on. But particularly in this area of the so-called enabling environment, it's a phrase that economists tend to use. Actually, in places like partly Pakistan, but certainly Afghanistan, you really have a disabling environment. Very poor governments, and the government doesn't extend to much of the country. Conflict is not confined to Afghanistan, but it's a real downer for affecting significant policies, and low female empowerment in that particular part of the world is a critical issue. So the whole political and social and economic environment does matter and has to be addressed not just by isolated interventions but by systems approach. Trade-offs and unintended consequences, I've hinted about those as far as the role of women in employment, women in agriculture versus women in the home. Those do matter. But also developing livestock is for me, increasing livestock products. As an ex-cowboy, increasing livestock products seems a great idea, except the health problems consequent upon having livestock around the house can be really damaging too. And if children actually are looking after the livestock, then that impacts on their education. So what are we on about? What are we trying to target? And are the mechanisms that we want to induce actually being counterproductive? Words and actions, briefly, governments say they'll do things and don't deliver. Even well-meaning politicians don't actually necessarily lead to effective policies. I've hinted at this question of defining success as well. What actually is the success? What are the targets? What are we trying to do? And overall, that context matters. There are, scaling up is something I've never been keen on scaling up. I've always seen in theory that it's a great idea, and it's something that you do with your new materials, your genetic materials, and you want to scale up. There are lots, there's nothing wrong with that, but in the socioeconomic world, scaling up to me seems to be very problematic because circumstances are often very, very different, and going into communities and understanding what works and what doesn't work means that there's tremendous heterogeneity amongst rural communities and even in urban communities as well. But that's a brief summary of a whole special issue of food policy. So you can look at the details some other time. But in Afghanistan, it's probably the basket case of what we were looking at. Food insecurity is really high, millions of people suffering from severe lack of food, about 10 million people moderately food insecure. The numbers are astonishing. Stunting levels in some districts of children under the age of 5 can exceed 70%. That is dreadful. Can't express how awful that is. And you add the conflict on top of that, and it's a very difficult country in which to begin to have an impact on these terrible figures. But cereals matter, they really do. Bread is eaten with every meal if it isn't, in fact, the total of every meal plus tea. Sometimes it is only in the foodstuff, so it's really, really important. Average annual per capita consumption. Average annual per capita consumption of 200 kilos, I think, is a lot. It's mostly winter wheat. Just about half of it is irrigated, but accounts for much more of the output than the unirrigated part. Production has fallen recently over the past years, which makes Afghanistan dependent on imports from Iran and Pakistan and Kazakhstan. And one of the difficulties there with food fortification, it would seem, that the food fortification idea is great, except the flour already comes from those countries and it's not fortified. And I think once it's milled, you can't really fortify. How can you mix it? It's at the milling stage, I believe, that the industrial fortification happens. So the dependence on external supplies that aren't amenable to fortification is a problem. So that is another counterbalance to the no-brainer that is industrial fortification. Obviously, there's scope for productivity improvements because your own people are working there. But the vulnerability of Afghanistan, particularly to climate change and extreme heat, lack of irrigation water, glaciers disappearing, it's very worrying, I think, in the medium to long term. Glaciers are being replaced by severe rainfalls, which just cause the mountains to run down. Roads get washed away, and there are earthquakes as well. You think of it. They haven't got volcanoes, as far as I know, but thinking of the problems and the impacts it has on production, markets, transport, logistics, distribution, and so on, it's not an easy environment. But dietary diversity is something that is high on the agenda. That quote on the right from the Central Statistical Office is really quite important. The population with poor consumption patterns tends to only occasionally, this is Afghan English, only occasionally eat meat, fish and eggs, dairy and dairy products, and nutrient-rich foods such as pulses and nuts. Their diet predominantly consists of wheat, oil and sugar only. Lots of carbohydrates. There is an urban transition in the diets, which is probably different from rural malnutrition, but we didn't work in that area, but it's something that's work still to be undertaken. But looking at questions of dietary diversity in general, there's a strong literature which shows that farm production is linked to household diversity, and hence the current emphasis on interventions, particularly things like fruit production, vegetable production, small-scale livestock production. But there is also growing evidence on the role of markets and access to markets, and we can see that in the work that we did introduce. So we did a very small piece of work. It's difficult to do field work, but we did a small piece of work on seasonality and food insecurity and nutrition insecurity in Bamyan, that central province. It's part of the Central Highlands region where there is the climate conditions are pretty difficult. Temperatures can drop to -20 below -20 centigrade and hover below freezing for 6, 7, even 8 months in a year. Perhaps that's more up in the northeast than in the centre, but they're extreme conditions, talking largely of populations that between 2.5, 3 and a bit more thousand metres above sea level. So winter is pretty awful and lasts a long time. And so thinking of agricultural production, the seasonality of food consumption, there is even the government has noticed there's a significant difference between food and nutrition insecurity at the different times of year. And I think an important element is that we also found that considerable difference between households depending on their socioeconomic circumstances. But Bamyan is one of the provinces where food insecurity is really, really high. It's beautiful to visit. Come with me, and it's fantastic. It really is. That's the Hindu Kush looking south. But we were looking at, that's the Hindu Kush on the left. This is actually more in Kandahar province, quite different. But we wanted to look at, in those sorts of conditions and sort of higher up into the mountains, what dietary diversity was like throughout the year, and the extent to which people relied on their own production and the extent to which they relied on food from markets, and how they could access markets, in these conditions of 2 feet of snow maybe. So those market food availability and seasonality considerations were really important elements of this. We've published a couple of things on that, so I'm summarising that bottom paper, the one there, largely. But we had a framework which looked at food and nutrition strategies, the importance of own production there on the left, market access on the right, and the factors which would affect it, the assets and gender issues, and the occasional ability of households to work together to reduce costs and support each other. But seasonality was the key issue. So there were questions of the impact on the agroecology, the production systems, but also on logistics and infrastructure, and feeling that climate change is exacerbating both of those elements. I won't spend longer on that. But what we did, it was very simple, in theory, a very simple approach to what we did. Just qualitative interviews of 2 households in 7 villages. But this built on the work of an NGO who had been working there for some time, and we published the paper and they got the final copy, and they wrote back to say, yes, this is what we see in the field, which was very reassuring because they were co-authors in the work. But they said, yes, this is right. Most of the households, in fact all the households we interviewed were male-headed households, from small to not so small, 12 people. Household economy was highly dependent on their own agriculture. Farm sizes were pretty small, not more than 2 hectares. They had occasional employment opportunities which brought income into the households. Agriculture in itself, soils were okay, but very much depended on the limited irrigation. Wasn't technically advanced, used farm-saved seed and a few agrochemicals, some purchased fertilizers, some compost of their own. It is wheat and potatoes, barley and alfalfa principally for livestock during the winter. They did produce dairy products for their own consumption, they have a few tree fruits. Actually, going back years, decades, Afghanistan was a major source of fruit products and almonds and pistachios. I believe the Russians are attributed with having cut down most of the pistachio trees. So actually things were better in the 1960s than they are now. But things like trees, fruit trees, and production is much reduced now, and there's certainly not enough to go around. But in these remote conditions, whereas they wanted to sell, potatoes particularly is a very important cash crop, living relatively far from markets. Well, 8 kilometres and 24 kilometres, that's not so far, but the roads are not good. They get low prices from traders. I'm going to skip over that in case you really want to know a bit more about household tasks, but go into this. This is going to be a little bit complicated, so I've tried it before. I haven't found a better way of representing these data than what I'm going to do. So perhaps feel free to interrupt as we go along. But I've got my traffic lights there of the major food groups on the left. We've got cereals and roots and tubers, which are okay. This is from a micronutrient perspective. Then vegetables, fruits, meat, and livestock products, pulses, of which there were very few, and nuts and seeds, if only there were more walnuts, if only there were more almonds and so on, which both grow extremely well, it would help. But the green is obviously the good stuff, and the red is my traffic light system says it's bad. Well, it's not just bad, but in terms of contribution to the diet, it's just energy and not much else, except forage foods at the bottom. There was a contribution from forage foods, but very small contribution. So going from those major food groups which are used in dietary diversity studies, we've got the source of those, either own production or purchased. And then I'm really trying to get, in the columns to the right, the frequency of consumption during different times of the year. There may be better ways of presenting this, but I haven't really got it. But what we've got, I sort of we broke the year down into quarters, more or less, so winter, spring, summer, and autumn, and also added in Eid as an important Muslim festival, and Ramadan too, when diets change, and sometimes people, it's an important time for festivals, when food consumption becomes much more luxurious in a way. But we've more or less got, under the seasonal quarter, we've got when the foods are consumed, but also the frequency during that year. So on one part it's availability, and then towards the right, per day or per week or frequency per month, we've got the extent to which those foods are actually consumed during those times when they are available, or not consumed when they're not available. So I'm going to highlight things as we go through. Cereals and roots and tubers, well, really important, eaten all the time, every day, sometimes once a day. But as you go across to the right, there'll be families that do have 3 meals a day. There'll be families who don't, but 3 or 4 times a week they'll be eating those products. Cereals are largely home-produced, or at least wheat is largely home-produced. Rice is purchased. There is some rice production up in the north, but most of it is imported. Potatoes are hugely important as well. They are grown and they're sold, so an important source of cash income, but at times they are purchased. But it's largely own production, available throughout the year, but not in huge quantities. There are times of hunger, and I'll come back to that right at the end. In looking for micronutrients to combat micronutrient deficiency, malnutrition, particularly amongst the vulnerable groups that we're talking about, we're then looking at these yellow stuff. There is some vegetable production, but there's purchase. Fruits, very limited production, but there's purchase as well from time to time. Most people will consume lamb or mutton, and some people will have poultry, so consume eggs and poultry meat. Many households have 1 or 2 cows, and pulses, big gap, I think, in the diets there, not much going on. Nuts and seeds are available, but not so much. So there's if you look at those, the season and the quarter, it's summer and autumn, or spring, summer and autumn, and special times. The nuts and seeds are actually eaten in the winter, are minimal. It's just a mouthful, a handful at very rare occasions. So there's not much there in the winter, that's actually green. But the frequency of consumption, compared with the yellow, all your green is shunted pretty much over to the right, which is indicating, in broad terms, much less frequent consumption. Now, what I don't know, and what many nutritionists have not been able to tell me, is how long can you go without vitamins until ill health starts setting in? Well, it's going to depend on age, it might depend on gender, it certainly depend on level of activity, and it's going to depend on the different vitamins and minerals, and so on. Actually, how long you can go without that affecting consumption, or without actually affecting metabolism, is really an open question. I don't think there's enough detail on the, we have recommended daily allowances, but how long can you go without it impacting health and nutrition? Well, for children born at the wrong time of the year and being weaned at a time when there are none of those green foods around, then that must be serious, because it's going to be some months before they'll actually get the opportunity to have micronutrient intakes. So there's a lot we don't know about the consumption side, but anyway, it's shifted to the right, and there's nothing in the winter, and there's not much of these products available. There are no vegetables and fruit available in spring. They don't come until the harvest season later. So the picture doesn't look very good there. Pulses, as I said, were, I think, an area that's, I don't know why they don't grow more pulses, but I hope they don't. That's the only consumption of micronutrient-rich foods we found, but it's pretty infrequently, monthly at best, for nuts and seeds. Perhaps I'll go back one. Oils and fats, yes, daily consumption. So energy needs are being met more or less throughout the year, although people were facing times, there were definitely times of hunger, not just micronutrient deficiency, but people did experience genuine hunger. In as much as they were able to store wheat and store potatoes during the year, they might actually have had energy foods into the next agricultural season, which is, energy is really important. But it might have been that the micronutrients didn't kick in until much later. But in the meantime, cereals, roots and tubers, or shall we say wheat, purchased rice and potatoes, and the other things, certainly the consumption of oils and fats in cooking, and sugars, which they love, do play a part in the diet. But it's the green that's largely missing. In the paper itself, we came up with ideas, such as diversification of crop production. I think that's something that's really important. Storage is really important, better storage so that, for example, potatoes don't go off. Secure storage for wheat. So new crops, maybe more livestock, but then that's affected by the rangeland resources. Grazing is a problem, so you can't keep livestock productive throughout the year. There are a number of technical things that might be done to improve the situation, but that's as far as agricultural systems go. The wider environment of the logistics and the infrastructure and so on. I think one important illustration of how difficult life could be for the winter, when they tended to hunker down, not much to be done except trying to keep warm. Firewood is scarce, and so cooking practices that are dependent on firewood are really important. You need to minimize use of firewood. But, for example, girls collecting water for cooking and for household functions. I don't know how you collect water when the ambient temperature is minus 20. No one was able to answer that question for me. But they did highlight how dangerous life can be in the winter too, and the inability to go to markets, so the isolation experience. Even if they're only 8 miles from the markets, they just can't get there, partly because of the meteorological conditions. But as we know, Afghanistan is not exactly a safe country. So we found that we were able to make quite a few suggestions about things that might be done. But what might be done in terms of the cereal world, and thinking perhaps more generally than Afghanistan? Some of my reflections do come out of the Afghan work, but more broadly, I'm taking off my micronutrient hat. I think micronutrients really do matter. There's no doubt about it. But I'm trying to get some balance, and I've actually, as this is being recorded, I'm not really sure whether I should have put up micronutrient madness, but I'm thinking of the enormous shift there has been in all the major institutions and all the NGOs and all governments about micronutrients and focusing on that, really forgetting that there are other foods that matter, among which are the staple cereals. I've actually defended the growth, the multiplication of cassava in Africa for the precise reasons that we may not really know it, but hunger hurts and dietary energy is essential to do physical work, and that is a real constraint for people in Afghanistan. People first want to be hungry, want to solve the hunger problem before they want to solve the micronutrient problem, because hunger actually hurts and energy just to live is really important. So it's not that micronutrients don't matter, but maybe the nutritional contribution of cereals is understated. That's something I'm thinking about, something you might agree with, but if that's the case, and if really there is a reflection in the literature and all the research that's being done by organisations such as IFPRI, who lead the field, then maybe there's some work to be done in sort of restoring cereals. The nutritional contribution of cereals is understated, perhaps because we take out all the goodness and we make bimbo bread instead. Most of the micronutrients are stripped out and fed to livestock, so let's not do that. One colleague I spoke with a few weeks ago said, if only we'd eat cereal grains, whole grain cereals, then the micronutrient problem would be finished. And that might be an exaggeration too. We know that biofortification works, you do it. Industrial fortification can work as well. There are obviously needs, opportunities to improve the micronutrient content of cereals. You're doing it, and there's more to be done for specific circumstances. Yes, there's definitely a need to increase productivity. In Afghanistan, it's really low, and as I pointed indirectly to the sort of low level of technical skills, perhaps, or technical assets in production. But do we need to increase productivity? Yes, with growing global populations, there's a lot to be done. Obviously, the increasing tolerance to stresses, and particularly climate change, is something I've witnessed, and it does. There's plenty of work to be done in that. The processing is an area I've had the opportunity to talk with some of you about processing technologies, but processing for better nutrition there's a big field out there, I think, and as I say, going back to the stripping out of the micronutrients to doing milling, we need to improve consumer preferences so whole grain products are actually consumed. There's work with industry, there's work with consumers. And if whole grains are unappetizing, what are we going to do about it? But to close, really what I want to say is that perhaps within cereals there is a hidden nutrient, which cereals are the principal fibers which contribute dietary fiber, principal foods that contribute dietary fiber, and there's quite a lot of evidence and increasing evidence that the wider health benefits of dietary fiber, not so much in nutrition, but in non-communicable diseases, a range of non-communicable diseases, not widely acknowledged in this nutrition debate. You might know all about it, but I don't think it isn't what people think about. That's the micronutrient preoccupation, shall I say, rather than the madness. Anyway, just some ideas to end with. Shall I go over and back to you, Olaf?
Okay, thank you, Nigel. We would like to open it up to any questions and answers. If Bruno, anybody else? Bruno, you want a mic? Sorry.
Should I start? Do I have a mic? Thank you for the interesting presentation. I'm glad you stay with us.
Till Saturday?
There's a lot of food for thought in what you have presented, but and I can understand that the supply side is really the driving force on the nutrition problem in Afghanistan. But I'm surprised that you never mention education change in diet habits, because even in places where you have access to all healthy food, people are still eating things that are not so unhealthy and not balancing their diet properly. So do you have any component in that in Afghanistan, or it's something that's not the first priority to solve?
I wouldn't say it's not the first priority. I suppose there are limits to the amount of to the scope of our research. And we didn't do, I would say, if we had another £1 million, we would have done a lot more work on consumption. There was some work done on India. It revolved around the seasonal consumption or availability and the consumption of fruits and vegetables and what could be done to increase the consumption of fruits and vegetables. Consumer preferences, we didn't look at cereals because we didn't look at changing consumption patterns. There was a fortification study, but we were working on micronutrients, so we largely ignored cereals. Preferences as far as cereal, whole grain products, it wasn't on our agenda, which is a bit of a failure, I think. Very happy to highlight it now. Broadly, I think people, if they like onions, they like more diverse foods, and are consumers willing to change? If it's something that they like, they will do, yes. They've got their urban nutrition transition towards less healthy foods. That is global. So people choosing to eat less productive foods, that's partly in the end a function of price, because it may be that certainly some fruits, maybe nuts, but some vegetables too or nutritious vegetables are beyond the reach of most people's buying capacity. So there is willingness to include, to consume better food, to include nutrient-rich foods in diets, but it is a function of availability. In the cities it's all there. In the rural areas it's not so easily available.
It's also a question of education and knowledge. I worked a long time in Africa, and you can see that with, for example, young mothers, there are concepts of nutrition that are not really well understood, and you have availability of different food nutrients available, but it's not always adopted and adapted to child nutrition.
Absolutely right. I think we did do some work on nutrition education. Water, sanitation and hygiene plus education are hugely important areas for nutrition that we didn't really go into in all that much depth. So I think you're right. Nutrition education is important. It's look around among ourselves, and actually changing people's mind about what they want to do isn't that easy. So plenty of work to be done there. Plenty of socioeconomics, all that. Yeah.
Obviously, the education part is important, but there's also a caveat there, in the sense that there's lots of narratives around food and what is healthy, which are not based on evidence. It's and this is not just in low and middle income countries, but in high income countries as well. There's a whole bunch of narratives out there which are weird. Let's put it that way.
I think that's right. I'm only learning. I've just got into dietary fibre recently, and I know there's work done. There isn't actually a globally accepted definition of what constitutes dietary fibre, let alone what is the important balance between amylose and amylopectin in starch granules and how they're digested and the speed of digestion. Yeah, some starches boost diabetes. They don't have to. Starch and dietary fibre doesn't have to. But there's a lot of technical knowledge there that's not known, and scare stories seem to run much more than decent science. But we have a communication challenge there.
Yeah, fascinating talk. I really enjoyed this stuff. Very interesting. From the start, I had a little voice in the back of my mind saying pulses. Where are the pulses? Until you spoke about the pulses. I'm actually very surprised, though, that it's not really part of their traditional diets in some way, because all throughout the Middle East, not sure about the ex-Soviet state, but then India, Pakistan, pulses are really big in their diet. So it looks like it's not, even if they can't grow them for whatever reasons, climate or soils or water. Perhaps they could import them, and they obviously import sugar. They eat a lot of sugar. So I was very surprised with that gap in a system. So
I think there is some available in the markets. These are quite remote people. It's true that pulses aren't an important part of the agricultural sector, as far as I know, as far as I can tell from all the data I've looked at. Of course, that's dramatically different from just over the border, or just over the border and a bit further in India, where pulses are a huge part of the diet. So it's a characteristic of Afghanistan, but it does point out how close countries can have quite different dietary habits. There is a thing called grass pea that's indigenous to the area. It isn't grown so much, or isn't consumed so much, because it has a toxin in it. I've forgotten what it's called, but there are difficulties in dealing with pulses. But I guess much of Afghanistan is more towards the Central Asia, and that perhaps is, it's bordered with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and then Iran, and there are lots of influences there. I don't suppose, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure that those are major pulse. They have a major pulse economy in those countries. Yeah. So it's a gap for whatever reason. I think it's an area in which one could work.
Dear Professor Poole, I really enjoy your talk. It's fantastic. My background is a molecular biologist. I'm a scientist. In the talk, you mentioned a lot about the vitamin A deficiency of the Afghanistan children. And there is a solution, as far as I know, is golden rice, has been studied for 20 years or so. And I know one of the neighbor country, Bangladesh, has recently improved their regulation on GMOs, but I haven't heard any comment on this topic, particular specific topic in your talk. Can you give a comment on that?
Yes, I have no evidence there's any golden rice at all in Afghanistan. It's not a major part of the diet, but it is there. I mean, there are wheat-consuming people above all, but golden rice hasn't really taken off everywhere. There are limitations to it. Why it hasn't taken off, like orange flesh sweet potato in Africa. The adoption of some of these new and some of this you should know better than I, but the adoption of some of these innovative crops or innovative varieties with added nutrients, it doesn't often happen easily. And I think that will apply to new varieties of biofortified wheat. There is work. You're doing work there. It's Ravi Sharma, is it? Work in Afghanistan. So there is work there, but I don't know that how much of your own biofortified products are there. But dissemination and uptake are really challenging for all these things. It's not just so that applies to golden rice, I think.
Yeah, I just answered that actually in fact working in Afghanistan, we are about to release 2 varieties of biofortified high-zinc varieties in Afghanistan. So one of my question is, so when the staple crops like wheat production goes down or the cost increase, so what is the situation related to the nutritious food, for example, vegetables and other high micronutrient rich foods. So have you observed, so what is the impact of the cereal production on the diet, overall diet?
I'm thinking how to answer that one. I don't think I've got enough data and knowledge to be able to comment. My 2 impressions on arriving first in Afghanistan in 2014 was, first of all girls coming out of school, which is not what I expected to see. It was Saturday and Kabul was flooded with girls coming out of school. Not what I expected, but that was Kabul. and it's not the rural areas. So female empowerment and female education, girls, it's happening. It's been boosted a lot, but that isn't typical of the country. Another characteristic is fruit and vegetable stalls all over the city. I think, so there is availability. It's a question of can people buy, and I think the poor people don't know very much at all about in detail about the nutritional status of urban populations, except from the macro data. Now, our work is primarily amongst rural populations who are remote and don't have easy access to markets. But a lot of fruit and vegetable available in all markets, all towns, if only people can get there, and only if they've got the income to buy them. So income depends on, in the first instance, they don't sell much wheat because they need it. They do sell potatoes, so it's an important source of income, and occasionally there's local employment at different times of the year. I mean, employment is seasonal, income from employment is seasonal, so they can buy when they've got the money. And actually, I haven't mentioned credit at all, but credit does flow around. But the consumption of what effectively are more costly foods that are nutrient-rich, such as livestock products. Livestock products are really quite rare. They're a treat. Eid and Ramadan are important times for consuming meat, so that's great, but it only comes once a year. Well, Eid comes 2 or 3 times a year, actually, I think. But Ramadan's only once a year, and so the opportunities these are treats. They're luxury goods, and so I don't know if in going round and round I addressed your question a bit.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, maybe just 2 comments from my side. I mean, one, thank you very much also for shedding some sober thinking on some of like industrial fortification. It sounds like a no-brainer, but indeed, if you start looking at the reality on the ground, things get more complicated. And so we do need a dose of realism to see what really works. But maybe also just for the audience, so South Asia is large and diverse, and the work you have focused on is primarily Afghanistan, which is probably of the whole region the most challenging, and has even gotten a lot worse since you were there, in the sense of politically.
Yeah, it's not my fault.
No, we very much welcome that you were able to share some findings there, but as we have also been discussing, I mean, security-wise, things have even turned worse. So it was already challenging at that time you were there, but it's even probably gotten even worse as we speak. So it's but do you see Afghanistan really as one extreme in South Asia, or in terms of the whole study did look across the region, and of course your work maybe focused on the Afghanistan side as you were more directly involved. But do you see this being replicated in other remote areas across South Asia, or is Afghanistan really a special story?
As you know, bits of Pakistan are very clear, very reminiscent of Afghanistan. I think if you go to remote areas in other places, the remoteness, the extreme geography of Afghanistan is a little bit unusual, but mountainous areas in Nepal would have it, I guess Tibet, Bhutan, there'd be places, high mountainous areas where they'd experience very similar sorts of difficulties, but maybe more greater dependence on rice. But what we observe for wheat or diets, staples in the diets, is probably reflected in rice elsewhere. Bangladesh, of course, is largely flat and maybe much more homogeneous, and I think it's I think there's a political instability. The role of government is a factor. The role of government is important throughout the region. I think there are parts of India, certainly some states in India, that are very successful and making dramatic improvements. But we did look at data comparing different Indian states from one to another, and there are huge differences in performance in terms of agricultural production and nutrition sensitivity. So I think that there'll be in different themes there'll be commonalities. Climate change, the water stresses in India would be different. I mean, it's not necessarily that they're running out of glaciers, although up in the north they will be, but they're running out of groundwater, and so that the challenges are slightly different. You've got huge businesses. The role of agribusiness in India is really important, and we did look. There were some interesting cases on trying to see the extent to which business could get involved and promote better nutrition, I think my take on that work is that business really is not into providing public goods such as good nutrition, but really making profit. And I think that will go from the input suppliers through to the food processors and the food retailers. I don't think generally they care. It's really profit that drives them. So actually working with them as a vehicle, using them in value chains to try to promote better nutrition. I think that's one of the global challenges, more than just the region. Is that okay?
Thank you so much, Nigel, for your presentation. I mean, you focused on South Asia. The SOAS is actually the African studies, so he's also done quite a bit of work in Africa. And maybe he didn't say so, but he also worked a lot in Latin America and even speaks fluent Spanish. And anyway, so you have covered the globe, and so we really look forward in terms of further collaborating. But if people want to follow up with him directly, so he's here physically up to Saturday, and then hopefully we'll have him back over the year in different times and periods. But thank you so much on behalf of everyone, and thanks.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for coming. It'll be a pleasure to work with you over the next year.